In the frozen winter of 1943, Japanese soldiers captured in the Pacific Theater braced for a nightmare. Torture, starvation, and humiliation were what they had been warned to expect. But what awaited them in America was something far stranger and far sweeter. Ice cream, Coca-Cola, laughter, and the shock of human kindness, luxuries that shattered their expectations and forced them to question everything they had been taught. Today, on Battlefield Secrets, we uncover the untold story of how captivity became a battlefield of the mind, where the most powerful weapon wasn't a gun, it was generosity. The surrender of Japanese soldiers in the Pacific Theater during the final years of the Second World War carried with it a weight of shame and foreboding unlike that of any other combatant. For men taught from their earliest days of service that surrender was dishonor, capitulation meant not only personal failure, but also a lasting stain upon their families. Japanese military propaganda had reinforced this conviction relentlessly. Leaflets, speeches, and commanding officers repeated the same warning. Capture by Americans meant torture, starvation, and certain death. Thus, when groups of exhausted soldiers finally laid down their arms on scattered islands across the Pacific, they did so with bowed heads, trembling hands, and hollow eyes. The conditions of surrender were often chaotic. Small groups emerged from caves or jungle clearings, emaciated from weeks of isolation, clutching tattered uniforms or makeshift white flags. They expected beatings or immediate execution. Instead, they were met with American soldiers who disarmed them quickly and efficiently, herding them into temporary enclosures under guard. Medical inspections followed in many cases, a procedure that left the prisoners uneasy. Blood pressure cuffs, thermometers, and vaccinations felt more invasive than merciful. To men who had been told that the enemy possessed no compassion, such orderly treatment appeared unnatural, even sinister. Transport to permanent facilities began swiftly. Records indicate that by 1944, tens of thousands of Japanese prisoners had already been moved into Allied custody, with a portion destined for camps within the continental United States. Prisoners were marched to harbors where transport ships waited, their steel hulls looming above the piers. Soldiers boarded in silence, flanked by guards, their minds occupied by dark imaginings of what awaited them on the other side of the ocean. Below deck, the holds were crowded but not unbearable rows of hammocks or cots, rations provided at intervals, water guarded carefully. Yet the atmosphere was one of suffocating dread. Some men refused to speak, while others whispered prayers or recited fragments of national songs, voices low and broken. Numbers fluctuated, but accounts suggest that transport ships often carried several hundred to a few thousand prisoners at a time. Conditions varied, yet the journey remained a psychological trial. The Pacific swells hammered against the hulls, and the prisoners, confined below deck, stared into the dark or clutched at the rough wood of the bunks. The thought of home-burned cities, absent families, an emperor awaiting victory reports haunted every man. Even more haunting was the silence about what their future held. On arrival at American ports, the process remained unexpectedly methodical. Guards ordered the prisoners ashore in lines. They were counted, checked, and herded toward trains that would carry them deep into a land most had only imagined through distorted images in propaganda leaflets. Through narrow railcar windows, they caught glimpses of landscapes utterly foreign: vast plains, small towns, snow-covered hills. Each sight contradicted what they had been told, that America was cruel, collapsing under decadence, a land of monsters. Yet there were no monsters here, only silence, fences, and soldiers carrying out their duties without malice or flourish. The prisoners felt no relief. Instead, suspicion thickened. Was this calm a facade, a prelude to something harsher? Could discipline and order mask a cruelty more insidious than open violence? As the trains pulled deeper into the country, faces pressed against the glass, watching fields blur past. Some men shivered, not from the winter air seeping through the cracks, but from the unanswerable question that hovered over them all. But what if captivity was not the nightmare they had been promised? The train slowed as it entered the outskirts of the camp. Through the frost-lined windows, the Japanese prisoners glimpsed barbed wire strung taut along high wooden posts, its coils glinting in the pale morning light. Beyond the fence, rows of barracks stretched in rigid formation, their roofs dusted with snow, their uniformity unsettling in its precision. Guard towers punctuated the perimeter at measured intervals, each manned by a sentry with a rifle slung across his shoulder, the silhouette of authority against the sky. For men schooled to expect the lash, the gallows, or worse, the scene carried its own quiet menace. Order, after all, could be as terrifying as chaos. The gates opened without ceremony, and the prisoners were marched inside under watchful eyes. Every step crunched against the frozen earth. The air smelled of smoke from wood stoves and of disinfectant sharp, unfamiliar, clinical. They passed through the yard in silence, their eyes darting to the fences, the towers, the guards stationed at precise points as though measuring every breath they took. Roll call began immediately. Prisoners were ordered to line up in formation, counted twice, then counted again. A guard with a clipboard paced slowly along the line, marking down numbers with methodical indifference. No blows were struck, no curses shouted, yet the weight of surveillance pressed down heavily. Every man felt the invisible leash of regulation tighten around him. The barracks offered little comfort. Long, narrow wooden buildings contained rows of bunks stacked too high, their blankets folded with military exactness. A potbelly stove burned at the center, its smoke curling into the rafters, leaving a faint film of soot. Each barack housed dozens of men, their personal space reduced to the width of a cot and the footlocker at its base. Order was evident in every detail. Tools neatly stacked, brooms against the walls, the faint scent of lime from the floors scrubbed each morning. To prisoners who had expected filth and decay, the barracks presented a different sort of challenge, discipline disguised as cleanliness. Daily routine began with the sharp ring of a bell before dawn. Roll call again, bodies counted in the gray light, the crunch of boots as guards patrolled the yard. Breakfast followed bread, coffee, sometimes oatmeal ladled from large steel pots. The food was plain but sufficient, almost startling in its quantity compared to the rationing they had endured before capture. Work details were then assigned: cleaning, kitchen duties, or, for those later trusted, farm labor outside the wire. Each task was supervised, each movement noted. The guards were watchful but not cruel. Orders were given in clipped English, gestures reinforcing what words could not bridge. Punishment was rare and, when it occurred, measured: extra duty, confinement, loss of privileges. The expected beatings never came. Yet the absence of violence was not reassuring. To the prisoners, it suggested calculation, a hidden strategy. Was kindness a weapon, designed to break them more thoroughly than any whip? At night, the barracks settled into uneasy quiet. The glow of the stove threw shifting shadows across the walls. Some men lay awake, staring at the rafters, replaying the day in silence. They whispered among themselves, weighing the paradox before them. Where was the cruelty they had been promised? Why did their captors treat them with such structured civility? Beyond the barracks, the searchlights swept rhythmically across the camp, beams slicing the darkness in precise arcs. The hum of a generator pulsed in the distance. The fence stood always in view, its barbs sharp and unyielding. The men began to sense that their captivity was not to be measured in beatings or starvation, but in subtler forms of control, surveillance, discipline, repetition. A prison without overt violence might still be a prison perfected. As one soldier whispered into the cold night air, his words echoed the unspoken fear of many: could discipline itself hide a more dangerous form of control? The prisoners entered the dining hall in single file, boots striking the wooden floor with the hollow rhythm of resignation. They expected thin gruel, perhaps scraps swept from the kitchens of their captors, reminders that they were defeated men to be starved into silence. Instead, the scent of cooked meat and fresh bread drifted toward them, unfamiliar and disorienting. For men accustomed to millet, watery soup, and the gnawing emptiness of rationing, the smell alone carried a strange weight. Rows of long tables stretched across the hall, benches aligned with mechanical precision. At the far end, USA Army cooks ladled food onto metal trays. Each prisoner, plate in hand, moved forward, watching in wary disbelief as portions were placed before them. Thick slices of bread, steam still rising from the crust. Meat, ground beef fashioned into patties, glistening with grease. A mound of boiled potatoes, carrots cut into even squares, and, on some trays, even a slice of pie. The men sat cautiously, glancing toward the guards as though a sudden strike might follow the unexpected generosity. Silence dominated the room, broken only by the scrape of trays and the clink of tin cutlery. At first, some hesitated to eat, convinced the meal was a cruel trick, a prelude to interrogation. But hunger overcame suspicion. Bread was torn and chewed. Meat disappeared in cautious bites that quickened into hunger's rhythm. For Japanese soldiers, the contrast was staggering. Their wartime rations had shrunk to a bare survival diet. Rice, when available, often stretched with barley or millet, dried fish or pickled vegetables on rare days. Sometimes nothing more than a handful of starch and bitter tea. By 1945, malnutrition was common, and hunger had eroded the men's bodies as surely as battle had scarred their spirits. Now, in captivity, the weight of a full plate felt almost indecent. One prisoner paused with his fork midair, his eyes fixed on the food. He whispered a word barely audible, more than we ever saw at home. Others nodded silently, their faces unreadable masks of awe and shame. To eat so well, when their families across the Pacific endured scarcity, felt like betrayal. Some forced themselves to eat slowly, as if restraint could dull the guilt that rose with every bite. The regulations explained it, though few prisoners knew the details then. U.S. Army policy, in compliance with the Geneva Convention, required POWs to receive rations equal to those of American soldiers. A typical camp diet provided around 3,000 calories daily: bread, meat, vegetables, milk when available. In contrast, American GIs in the field often received less when supply lines faltered. The irony deepened as prisoners slowly realized that, in this strange reversal, they ate better than some of the men guarding them. Yet abundance carried its own unease. Suspicion lingered that such generosity must serve a purpose beyond mere compliance with international law. Was food itself a tool? Could kindness become a method of disarmament, undermining loyalty more effectively than violence? The men debated in whispers after the meal, weighing propaganda against the tangible reality of a full stomach. By evening, the barracks echoed with quiet reflection. Some lay on their bunks, hands folded across their stomachs, still disbelieving the fullness they felt. Others stared at the ceiling beams, imagining the faces of their families who scraped by on rations of little more than rice and watery broth. Gratitude and guilt, suspicion and wonder, wrestled silently in the minds of men who had prepared for starvation but been met instead with abundance. The snow outside the windows glowed faintly under searchlights, casting shadows across the barracks floor. In that quiet glow, the men understood that captivity had not stripped them of hunger, it had redefined it. Hunger now meant not just for food, but for answers, for explanations that made sense of this inversion of cruelty and kindness. And so the question lingered, as unsettling as the full stomachs they carried into uneasy sleep. Could food itself become a weapon of the mind? The evening meal ended with an unexpected offering. After bread, meat, and boiled vegetables, the prisoners were handed small bowls and tin spoons. From large trays came portions of cake-dense squares topped with white frosting or, in some cases, chocolate pudding ladled with a casual abundance. The men received the dishes in silence, staring at the glossy sheen of chocolate and the soft crumble of sugar-dusted bread as though they had been handed relics from another world. For soldiers who had fought under the banner of the Imperial Army, such foods existed only in memory, rumor, or imagination. Wartime Japan had been stripped bare of luxury. Sugar, once a common household staple, had become a rarity by the early 1940s, diverted almost entirely to military supply chains or lost to shortages. Civilians stretched their rations with substitutes, saccharin powders, diluted syrups, while sweets all but disappeared from daily life. Children who had once licked candy wrappers now clutched empty hands. To taste chocolate or cake in 1943 Japan was to taste memory itself. Now, in captivity, the forbidden sweetness rested on their trays. Some men hesitated, spoons idle in hand, unwilling to take the first bite. Others, drawn by hunger and curiosity, lifted the dessert to their mouths. The taste was overwhelming: soft cake that melted against the tongue, pudding rich with cocoa, flavors so concentrated after years of deprivation that they seemed almost unbearable. A few men closed their eyes, swallowed quickly, and turned away, as if ashamed to linger on the sensation. The room filled with quiet murmurs. A soldier whispered that it reminded him of festivals before the war, when neighborhood stalls sold sweet rice cakes wrapped in leaves. Another muttered of his younger sister, who had begged for candy even as supplies vanished. Some held their bowls tightly, as though savoring sweetness might summon those lost memories into the present. For every smile that threatened to emerge, there was a shadow of sorrow. The guilt struck hardest. To enjoy the abundance of the enemy felt like betrayal not just to emperor and nation, but to the families across the Pacific struggling against hunger. Each spoonful reminded them of children with hollow stomachs, wives waiting in cold kitchens, mothers dividing rations with quiet endurance. To eat cake while their homeland starved was a wound deeper than any battlefield injury. American abundance, so casual and unthinking, contrasted violently with Japanese deprivation. In the United States, even amid rationing, sugar and cocoa remained more available than in Japan, where blockades and shortages had reduced luxury to myth. A USA camp could offer chocolate pudding to its prisoners, while civilians in Tokyo dreamed of little more than rice. The inversion of privilege was staggering. By the end of the meal, the hall was subdued. Bowls lay empty, some scraped clean, others barely touched. Prisoners sat with lowered eyes, as though they had been tested in ways they could not name. A guard collecting trays glanced at the men without expression, his movements indifferent, routine. For him, cake was an ordinary ration. For the captives, it was a collision between memory and survival. That night, in the barracks, the men whispered in low voices. Some admitted the dessert had been the first truly sweet thing they had tasted in years. Others confessed the flavor had made them ache for home in ways they had not felt since capture. And beneath it all lingered suspicion: was such abundance meant to soften them? To weaken their resolve? Could sweetness itself serve as a weapon, dissolving loyalty more effectively than punishment ever could? Outside, the snow had hardened into ice, the wind rattling faintly against the barracks walls. Within, the men lay restless, the taste of sugar lingering on their tongues like an unanswered question. Was this kindness, or a slow erosion of loyalty? The prisoners did not expect luxuries. They expected rations, routine, and the steady weight of captivity. But one afternoon, when the dining hall doors opened, they were met with something that made them falter. Bottles of dark glass stacked in wooden crates, and bowls of pale, frozen cream carried on trays. Coca-Cola, ice cream. For Americans, these were ordinary comforts, so common that soldiers overseas received them as part of morale packages. But for Japanese prisoners, they were relics of another world, symbols of abundance beyond imagination. Some had seen the Coca-Cola logo before, painted on shipping crates or mentioned in intercepted propaganda, but none had ever lifted a sweating bottle, cap hissing as it was pried away. The ice cream, served in rounded scoops, seemed almost magical, soft clouds of white that trembled under spoons, melting at the edges. At first, there was silence. The men looked from bottle to bowl, unsure if this was a test. Then, cautiously, one soldier raised the glass. The fizz rose quickly, tickling his nose as he drank. The taste was unlike anything familiar: sharp, sweet, effervescent. He gasped, coughed, then laughed despite himself, a sound so rare in the camp that others turned in surprise. Soon more followed, lips sticky with syrup, eyes wide with disbelief. The ice cream struck deeper. Japan had known frozen sweets in its cities before the war, but such luxuries had vanished long before these men had marched into the Pacific. To taste it again, cold, smooth, almost painfully sweet, was to remember childhood festivals, summer streets, and a country before ruin. A few men lifted their bowls and paused, their eyes wet, as though the melting cream carried both joy and sorrow in equal measure. In that room, laughter broke out sudden, unrestrained, like children discovering play. Some prisoners teased each other for dripping soda down their chins. Others shivered dramatically as the ice cream numbed their teeth. Yet amid the noise, there were also tears. One soldier turned his face to the wall, shoulders shaking, ashamed to weep over a bowl of cream. Another muttered that his family had not seen such food in years, that his children would scarcely believe this story if it were ever told. The guards watched with detached amusement, offering no explanation. For them, Coca-Cola and ice cream were ordinary tokens of American life. Cheap comforts extended even to captives. Yet for the prisoners, the experience was disorienting. How could the enemy, painted by Japanese propaganda as monstrous, offer delight so innocent? Was this generosity or something more insidious? The moral conflict was acute. Cruelty could be resisted, suffering could harden resolve. But joy, simple and unexpected, struck at the core. To laugh, to savor sweetness, to share a moment of common pleasure with captors, this felt more dangerous than any punishment. It was not pain but kindness that threatened to erode the boundaries of loyalty. That evening, long after the bottles were emptied and the bowls collected, the camp remained unsettled. Men lay awake, replaying the fizz against their tongues, the cold sweetness melting down their throats. Some whispered that such luxuries were designed to soften them, to weaken their spirit. Others confessed quietly that, for a moment, they had forgotten the war entirely. Outside, the snow lay thick, reflecting moonlight across the barbed wire. Inside, men wrestled with an enemy more dangerous than rifles or guards, the dangerous seduction of comfort. Could sweetness break stronger than steel? The morning air was sharp and cold, carrying the scent of frost on soil and livestock. Bundled in thick coats and gloves that did little against the biting wind, the prisoners stepped out beyond the barbed wire into fields that seemed endless under a pale winter sun. Each man carried tools: pitchforks, shovels, bundles of straw, and a quiet skepticism. Work awaited, as it always did, but this labor was not punishment. It was productivity sanctioned by their captors. They fed the animals first. Cattle lowed with patient curiosity, their breath visible in the icy air, while chickens pecked at scattered grains. The prisoners moved with methodical care, wary of missteps but quickly noting that the animals were calm, tended by farmers who offered instructions and occasional nods of approval. Their training in efficiency and endurance was put to use, yet the atmosphere was surprisingly devoid of coercion. Mistakes were corrected gently, complaints met with reason, not derision. Harvesting came next. Frozen ground resisted plows, frost-laden vegetables required careful extraction, and each task brought its own fatigue. The prisoners' muscles ached from unfamiliar labor lifting bundles, bending repeatedly, but their exhaustion was tempered by a sense of order and fairness that had been absent in their wartime experience. Here, work was not a tool of humiliation. It was routine, structured, and strangely dignified. Payment arrived at the end of the day. Small slips recorded hours and wages, a novelty that unsettled as much as it intrigued. The men had been taught that captivity meant deprivation, that food and labor were instruments of control. Instead, they were given not only sustenance but acknowledgement of their effort. Some glanced at the coins or scrip in hand, incredulous, exchanging silent looks that conveyed confusion, suspicion, and reluctant gratitude. American families, whom they encountered during these work details, displayed another layer of dissonance. Mothers called out directions politely. Children shyly offered small gifts: apples, scraps of bread, and fathers nodded approval when tasks were completed efficiently. Occasionally, a farmer would offer hot cocoa or a piece of pie, gestures that conflicted violently with the prisoners' expectations of hatred or scorn. Each act of kindness was a reminder of normalcy, yet also a trigger for internal questioning. Why would enemies treat them with such civility? The Geneva Convention of 1929 outlined the rights of prisoners, including labor that was safe, fairly compensated, and non-military in nature. Many POWs were aware of this in theory, but theory did not prepare them for the tangible reality of fairness or the psychological impact of being treated as human rather than mere spoils of war. They noticed the contrast sharply. In Japan, civilians were starving, work was coerced, and punishment often followed failure. Here, effort was acknowledged, mistakes corrected without cruelty, and basic dignity preserved. By the day's end, their bodies were exhausted, faces flushed from exertion and cold alike. Yet the mind remained unsettled. Laughter among children, polite conversation with farmers, the gentle clatter of tools and animals, all these struck at the prisoners' ideological armor. Could civility exist without hidden motives? Could fairness be genuine when it came from one's captors? As they trudged back toward the camp, boots crunching against frozen earth, the questions lingered. Some accepted the work silently, grateful but uneasy. Others whispered quietly about the absurdity of enemies paying them for labor. Each man carried more than fatigue. They carried cognitive dissonance, the subtle erosion of indoctrinated beliefs through simple, humane acts. Why would enemies pay their captives? The snow-crusted road led the prisoners past the edge of the camp and into the broader expanse of farmland, where smoke curled lazily from chimneys and children's laughter echoed across frozen fields. For many of the Japanese POWs, these were the first sights of civilian life outside their own regimented and grim experience. They approached cautiously, wary of hidden intentions, yet curiosity overcame caution as figures appeared along fences and porches. A small group of children, faces red from the cold, waved shyly, offering handfuls of snow in playful gestures. Mothers emerged from houses carrying wrapped loaves of bread or bundles of warm clothing. The men paused, unsure whether to bow in gratitude, refuse politely, or retreat. Cultural training had drilled them in suspicion. They had been taught to expect animosity, perhaps violence. Instead, they were met with smiles, nods, and quiet hospitality. One farmer's wife, wearing a woolen shawl and apron dusted with flour, extended a loaf of freshly baked rye. Her hands trembled slightly with effort, but her eyes conveyed no judgment, only generosity. A few POWs hesitated, scanning the fields and fences, expecting guards or hidden threats. Yet the women gestured insistently, reassuring in their calm composure. Among them, a young boy offered a hand-carved wooden toy, its craftsmanship crude but heartfelt. The men accepted it mechanically at first, then slowly with reluctant warmth, the weight of simple human connection pressing against ingrained suspicion. Clothing was offered next. Gloves, scarves, and mittens found their way into frozen hands, each item a practical relief and a subtle lesson in kindness. Some prisoners slipped them on immediately, marveling at the softness and warmth, noting the quality that contrasted starkly with what they had seen in Japan during wartime shortages. Mufflers will caress their necks, a hat insulated their ears, yet each gesture brought a pang of guilt. Accepting such kindness from the enemy was incomprehensible and, in a way, terrifying. The soldiers moved slowly along the paths, observing family routines, the mother feeding chickens, the father chopping firewood, children dragging sleds in playful competition. These were ordinary scenes of domestic life, yet their impact on the prisoners was extraordinary. For the first time, they confronted a world in which the enemy was neither cruel nor calculating, but human in ways they had never imagined. Awe mingled with guilt, wonder warred with disbelief. A private thought surfaced repeatedly in several minds. Could such simple kindness be more disorienting and more dangerous than any form of cruelty they had anticipated? Each act of generosity sparked internal reflection. Some POWs, accustomed to the strict hierarchy and stoicism of military life, found themselves secretly preferring these strangers' warmth to the rigid authority of their own officers. The idea was unspoken, even unacknowledged, yet the cognitive dissonance was palpable. Obedience had been instilled, suspicion drilled into them. Yet these ordinary acts of humanity challenged their beliefs more sharply than any battlefield experience. They smiled cautiously, bowed, and accepted, their hearts heavy with a mix of relief, gratitude, and moral confusion. As the prisoners retraced their steps toward the camp, the memory of open doors and warm hands lingered. Each loaf of bread, each glove, each fleeting smile unsettled them more than any threat ever had. It was a quiet, disarming kind of psychological tension, a confrontation with the unexpected humanity of those they had been taught to hate. Could kindness be more terrifying than cruelty? The evening air inside the wooden barracks carried a faint, almost imperceptible vibration. From a small, scratchy radio perched atop a wooden crate, a series of brisk rhythms emerged: brass, percussion, and the unmistakable swing of Benny Goodman's clarinet, interlaced with Glenn Miller's smooth trombone lines. For the Japanese POWs, accustomed to the austere cadence of military marches and the silence of disciplined barracks, the sound was a revelation and an unsettling one. At first, the men approached the radio cautiously. A few stood stiffly, hands folded, faces tense with expectation, fearing some hidden trick or a reprimand from a guard. Yet the music continued unabated, broadcast over the public frequency channels, as soldiers from other units tapped their feet lightly, swayed subtly, or nodded to the beat. The unfamiliar melodies carried an energy that was at once joyous and disorienting, a stark contrast to the harsh realities of war they had known. Some POWs attempted to suppress their reactions. One young soldier, tall and wiry with the faintest trace of soot under his fingernails from his morning duties, clenched his jaw and avoided eye contact with those who hummed along softly. Yet a few could not resist. Fingers tapped on wooden crates, shoulders swayed unconsciously, and lips barely parted to echo the rhythms. It was a betrayal they could not articulate, an unbidden pleasure in the culture of the very nation that had captured them. The tunes themselves were more than music. They were a window into a world the prisoners had never known. Swing and jazz, with their improvisational bursts and syncopated beats, defied the rigid structures of military life. They conjured images of bustling dance halls, crowded city streets, and civilians laughing freely, a universe far removed from ration lines, sirens, and the constant shadow of death. Each note carried not only rhythm but a subtle psychological weight, challenging the prisoners' ingrained beliefs about the enemy. One of the men, a mid-ranking corporal with a shaved head and a uniform meticulously buttoned, found himself leaning closer to the radio. He closed his eyes as the saxophone solo wove through the barracks, and for the first time in months, he allowed himself a faint smile. Around him, others tried to mask their amusement, worried that enjoyment might be seen as treasonous by comrades, or worse, as weakness. Yet the music persisted, insistent and innocent, penetrating the walls of suspicion and fear. Factual reminders of the era grounded the moment. 1940s American radio stations were increasingly broadcasting swing across rural and urban areas alike, bringing Benny Goodman and Glenn Miller into homes, schools, and even unexpectedly POW camps. Camp recreation regulations permitted listening at designated hours, a concession meant to maintain morale and obedience. Yet in practice, it exposed prisoners to the intoxicating charm of American culture in a controlled environment. By the end of the evening, a subtle shift had occurred. The barracks were quiet once more, yet the rhythms lingered in memory. Some soldiers hid their humming in private corners. Others replayed the melodies in thought, unwilling or unable to admit the pleasure aloud. The music had planted a seed of internal conflict, fascination tangled with guilt, curiosity threaded through with shame. It was a gentle, persistent subversion of loyalty, not through coercion, weapons, or threats, but through the simple, universal human language of sound. What happens when the enemy's song becomes your own? The barracks were dimly lit, the frosted windows casting elongated shadows over rows of wooden bunks. A small projector clattered faintly as it hummed to life, casting flickering black and white images onto a canvas sheet suspended between two poles. For the Japanese POWs, accustomed to stark discipline, ration newsreels, and propaganda films, this spectacle was startling, an entirely new form of storytelling that both fascinated and unsettled. Soldiers gathered cautiously, their uniforms stiff, hands tucked behind backs, eyes wide with anticipation. The first frames illuminated the canvas, glamorous actors, perfectly coiffed women in flowing gowns, men laughing with a casual confidence that seemed almost alien. The screen transported them to a world beyond the barbed wire, a world where laughter was spontaneous, not rationed, where wealth and leisure existed even amidst a global conflict. At first, the men maintained formal composure. One thin corporal with neatly combed hair shifted his weight uncomfortably, aware that any outward display of delight might be viewed as weakness by his peers. Yet the images were irresistible. Children playing in snow-laden streets, couples dancing to swing rhythms, cinematic heroes confronting challenges with charm rather than fear. Each frame carved a fissure in the prisoners' strict mental barriers. The films themselves were carefully selected. Wartime recreation officers screened comedies, musicals, and dramas, avoiding overtly propagandistic content that might provoke dissent. Popular 1940s features, such as Stage Door Canteen or Casablanca, projected both glamour and the American ethos of resilience, freedom, and leisure. In the darkened barracks, The prisoners saw ideals foreign to their experience: comfort without fear, laughter without punishment, and a society that seemed to celebrate life rather than merely survive it. Reactions were subtle but profound. Some soldiers pressed their hands over their mouths to stifle a laugh. Others leaned forward, eyes glistening as they absorbed scenes of romance and camaraderie. The irony was inescapable. While comrades back home struggled with hunger, air raids, and loss, here they sat, fed, warm, and invited to witness joy in its purest form. The contrast between expectation and reality deepened the psychological tension. In corners, quiet murmurs emerged, comparisons between the on-screen American world and the rigid structures of Japanese military life. A few prisoners whispered about how life could exist outside sacrifice and obedience, while others recoiled at the thought, fearing that longing for freedom was a betrayal of duty. Even the smallest chuckle became a moral quandary, a confession that they could feel happiness despite the ideology instilled in them since youth. By the final reel, the barracks were silent save for the projector's mechanical rhythm. The screen faded to black, leaving only the glow of reflection in the prisoner's eyes. Shadows of imagined cities, unscarred landscapes, and untroubled citizens lingered, etching dreams of a place that seemed simultaneously unreachable and achingly close. For the first time, imagination became a clandestine escape, a psychological refuge beyond fences, guards, and rules. Could imagination escape the barbed wire even when the body could not? The barracks were hushed, the faint scrape of pen against paper, the only sound interrupting the muffled whistle of wind against frost-laden windows. Japanese POWs huddled over narrow wooden desks, their gloved fingers stiff with cold as they dipped nibs into inkwells. Even the ink resisted warmth, forming fragile beads on the surface before reluctantly adhering to the paper. Each letter was a measured act of communication, a fragile bridge between captivity and home. The soldiers wrote cautiously, acutely aware that American censors would inspect every line. References to camp conditions were permitted only in the most factual sense: rations, work assignments, and occasional mundane observations. Any hint of complaint, escape, or moral judgment was promptly redacted. Each stamped envelope bore a uniform mark, censored, a small, impersonal reminder that their words were not fully their own. Despite the constraints, emotion seeped through. Corporals and privates alike paused frequently, staring at the frozen landscape outside, imagining snow on distant roofs in Japan. Thoughts of mothers, wives, and children weighed heavily. They wrote of longing, carefully omitting fear or criticism. Some scribbled tentative reassurances of safety, knowing they could not convey the full spectrum of isolation and anxiety they endured daily. For many, the act of writing was a paradoxical mix of relief and despair. A young private with sunken cheeks wrote a detailed account of his minor duties on the farm, yet secretly, he hoped the letter would never arrive. Rumors filtered through the camp, cities bombed beyond recognition, villages reduced to ashes, lives torn asunder. In these unspoken truths, some POWs harbored a quiet desire to delay repatriation, to remain in the ordered, humane environment of American captivity rather than return to devastation. Cultural and moral conflicts gnawed at them. The ink froze more readily in the cold draft from the barracks door, mirroring the frozen tension in their chests. They felt guilt for enjoying warmth, food, and civility while families and comrades at home suffered. A corporal paused mid-sentence, pressing the pen to paper, battling with the notion that expressing longing or joy could be seen as betrayal. Every line became a careful negotiation between honesty and loyalty, emotion and obedience. Outside, snow blanketed the camp with quiet persistence, muffling distant shouts and the creak of guard towers. Within, the prisoners' thoughts wandered to ruined rooftops in Hiroshima, to the loss of friends in the Pacific, to the idea of returning to a homeland that may no longer exist as remembered. The letters were vessels of hope, yet laced with despair, a delicate balance between duty and the human need to connect. As the final strokes were made, envelopes sealed, and stamps affixed, the barracks fell into reflective silence. Each soldier contemplated the precarious path ahead, uncertain whether these letters would provide solace or only amplify the chasm between expectation and reality. For many, the very act of correspondence underscored the paradox of captivity, safety, and abundance alongside fear and moral disquiet. Was home still home, or just ruins waiting for their return? Snow lay thick on the roofs of the small Midwestern farmhouse, its white expanse glinting faintly in the flickering lamplight. Japanese POWs, led by guards in heavy winter coats, approached cautiously, boots crunching against the crusted snow. They had heard whispers of the locals' holiday gatherings, but could not have imagined the warmth that awaited. The modest wooden door opened, and a flood of light, music, and faint aromas spilled into the cold night, revealing a scene that contrasted sharply with the harsh, regimented order of the camp. Inside, the room was suffused with the golden glow of candles and lanterns. The air carried the mingling scents of roasted meats, baked bread, and spiced desserts. A small group of townsfolk, men, women, and children, greeted the prisoners with tentative smiles. The soldiers' initial suspicion was palpable. Decades of propaganda had instilled a deep mistrust, warning that every gesture of civility might conceal malice. Yet the warmth was unmistakable. Tables were laid with simple abundance. Platters of turkey, glazed hams, potatoes, and fresh vegetables were complemented by pies, puddings, and homemade cookies. Children peeked shyly from behind chairs, offering small bites of pastry to the POWs. The soldiers hesitated, hands hovering above unfamiliar dishes, torn between hunger, curiosity, and ingrained wariness. One young private, accustomed to ration meals in Japan, felt a lump rise in his throat at the sight of butter and sugar freely given. The abundance was shocking, almost surreal. Music filled the room. A piano played gently in the corner while a father hummed an old folk tune. Laughter punctuated conversations, blending seamlessly with the low hum of fire from the hearth. POWs, hesitant at first, gradually allowed themselves to observe, to taste, to listen, to participate. Their laughter, tentative at first, became genuine as they tried to sing along with the children, their Japanese accents softening in harmony with the unfamiliar rhythm. Despite the warmth, a tension underlay every action. Every bite taken carried a whisper of guilt, every laugh a shadow of shame. Some soldiers remembered Christmases spent in bombed-out cities, mothers scavenging for scraps, fathers lost to the Pacific. To sit here, indulging in abundance and conviviality, felt like a betrayal, yet the simple human kindness tugged insistently at their hearts. The moral paradox was disorienting. Enemies, yet hosts, strangers, yet family for this night. One corporal, observing the children decorating small trees with hand-cut ornaments, felt an unfamiliar swell of emotion. Nostalgia mixed with guilt, the warmth of this gathering highlighted the absence of home. Another soldier quietly traced the rim of his glass, noting the contrast between this life and the devastation reported in letters from Japan. Each smile and gesture from the townsfolk became a mirror, reflecting both the beauty and the complexity of human connection. As the evening progressed, the POWs were invited to partake in games and small rituals, lighting candles in sequence, exchanging handmade gifts, and singing carols. For a brief moment, the strict boundaries of captivity seemed suspended. Yet beneath the cheer, the soldiers remained acutely aware of the invisible divide, barbed wire, and military authority lurking just beyond the warmth of the room. When the gathering concluded, the POWs stepped back into the icy night, hearts heavy and minds conflicted. The snow crunched underfoot. Mirroring the weight of emotion, they carried joy interlaced with guilt, human connection tempered by ideological loyalty. The memory of warmth, laughter, and generosity remained vivid, a beacon of dissonance against the backdrop of war. Could joy exist where war demanded only sorrow? The small church stood amid a cluster of snow-dusted houses, its steeple pointing skyward against a gray winter sky. Japanese POWs, led under the watchful eyes of American guards, paused at the entrance, uncertain whether to proceed. The wooden doors opened quietly, and the warm glow of candlelight spilled onto the frosted path, illuminating cautious faces. Inside, a congregation of locals knelt and sang, their voices mingling with the faint echo of the organ. The first notes of the hymn penetrated the chill, simple but resonant, a melody of hope and reflection, its harmonies unfamiliar yet compelling. Soldiers observed silently from the back pews, their rigid postures betraying a mixture of reverence, confusion, and deep suspicion. They had been taught that the enemy was irredeemable, that acts of kindness or piety toward captives were impossible. Yet here, in this unassuming wooden sanctuary, Americans sang prayers not only for their families, but for all affected by the war, including the prisoners themselves. The POW's eyes scanned the congregation, men in threadbare suits, women in modest dresses, children with bright scarves and attentive eyes. Every face was earnest, and every gesture unguarded. The soldiers noted the subtle kindness in the invitation extended to them. A chaplain quietly gestured to a vacant pew, and some families offered hesitant smiles. The moral weight of the moment pressed on the captives. They were trained to view Americans as enemies, yet here they were, welcoming them into a space devoted to peace and reflection. As the sermon began, discussing forgiveness, human dignity, and the costs of conflict, the soldiers listened intently, some bowing their heads without fully understanding every word. The universality of the message, faith transcending national boundaries, prayers offered for those on both sides of the battlefield, chilled them more profoundly than any battlefield winter. A corporal, hardened by months of combat, felt a sudden tremor of doubt. Could loyalty to one's country withstand the quiet, persuasive force of compassion? The prayers that followed were both simple and deliberate, petitions for families, the safe return of soldiers, and for the cessation of hostilities. Each word carried an unexpected weight, as if faith itself had become a subtle interrogator of conscience. The POWs shifted uncomfortably, their minds questioning the rigidity of indoctrination versus the human capacity for mercy. One young soldier remembered his commanding officer's warnings. Surrender was dishonor. Kindness from the enemy was a trap. And yet, he could feel no malice here, only genuine hope. When the service concluded, a hushed silence lingered. The chaplain extended a quiet invitation to speak, but the prisoners remained mute, unsure how to reconcile etiquette, gratitude, and ingrained ideology. The congregation filed out, leaving the POWs alone with their thoughts and the fading echoes of hymns. Outside, the snow had thickened, covering footprints in the soft hush of evening. The cold air bit at exposed faces, but internally, the captives felt an unfamiliar warmth, the stirring of moral questioning, of doubts seated in faith's quiet presence. Walking back to the barracks, the soldiers carried more than the memory of melodies. They carried the weight of realization. Enemy lines were not solely defined by barbed wire or weapons, but could be crossed by acts of belief, kindness, and prayer. The concept was disorienting, a subtle challenge to loyalty, a quiet psychological tension they had not anticipated. What if faith itself could cross enemy lines? The barracks were silent, save for the soft creak of floorboards and the occasional distant bark of a camp dog. Japanese POWs huddled on narrow wooden bunks, their bodies wrapped in threadbare blankets, eyes reflecting flickering oil lamps. Sleep was fitful, haunted by images of distant battlefields and the discipline of home. Yet in these quiet hours, unbidden thoughts of a different future began to creep into their minds. Some whispered softly to one another, careful to keep their voices low. The conversations were cautious, conspiratorial, as if even the walls could report disloyalty. What if one began, then faltered? The ellipsis carried more weight than any words could bear. Others listened, faces tense, caught between curiosity and fear. The notion of life beyond barbed wire, beyond the rigid codes of obedience, was intoxicating yet taboo. They imagined streets cleared of rubble, fields untended yet producing abundance, and towns where laughter and music coexisted with daily toil. They pictured snow-covered landscapes in winter, quiet forests in spring, and American families who might smile at them without suspicion. The POWs, trained to view surrender as shame, felt a dangerous warmth in such visions. Some imagined working alongside farmers without fear of beatings. Others saw themselves walking freely through towns where kindness, not cruelty, governed interaction. Yet these visions carried immediate guilt. Japanese military indoctrination had framed surrender as the ultimate dishonor. To dream of permanence in enemy lands was to betray their homeland. Some prisoners pressed their hands against their foreheads, as if to physically block these thoughts, while others stared silently at the ceiling, unable to extinguish the allure of imagined freedom. Whispers turned to subtle arguments should they reveal these thoughts to comrades, or keep them buried, hidden even from themselves. The fear of being reported, of dishonoring fellow soldiers, weighed as heavily as any iron bar or guard tower. Outside the barracks, snow clung stubbornly to fences, and the muted winter light reflected off the white expanse. Inside, the psychological tension mirrored the frozen landscape, stark, silent, deceptively serene. Some POWs lay awake, eyes tracking the shadows cast by candlelight, imagining a future where the rigid structure of war was replaced with choice. One corporal, hardened by battle, felt a flicker of shame at the pleasure this thought brought, while another young soldier smiled faintly, almost imperceptibly, as he considered the possibility of remaining in America after the war. Factual realities intruded upon their musings. Repatriation policies were rigid. The Geneva Convention required POWs to return to their homeland when hostilities ceased. Yet the soldiers were not yet prisoners of law alone, they were prisoners of habit, of indoctrination, and of imagination. Each man wrestled with the duality, the safety and kindness of the camp versus the duty drilled into them since youth. The line between moral loyalty and human desire blurred with every heartbeat. By midnight, the barracks lay in complete darkness, save for the occasional flicker of a candle left burning. Thoughts of snow, ice cream, and uncensored laughter clashed violently with guilt, fear, and duty. The POWs confronted a paradox. Captivity, bound by fences and guards, might paradoxically offer a taste of freedom their homeland, ravaged by war and expectation, could no longer guarantee. Could captivity feel freer than the land they once swore to die for? Spring arrived slowly, hesitating over the snow-blanketed fields that had marked the POW's landscape for months. Frosted fences and frozen streams began to yield, revealing dark earth beneath, water trickling from thawing rivulets. The prisoners noticed the subtle transformation in the camp. Wooden barracks glistened under intermittent sun, smoke from chimneys curled lazily into warming air, and the bitter bite of winter became a distant memory. Yet beneath this seasonal shift, tension and reflection took root, heavier than the melting ice. Preparations for repatriation stirred in quiet, disciplined routines. Officers counted head numbers, checked identification, and issued instructions for transport to ports that would carry them back to Japan. The Japanese POWs, who had grown accustomed to the orderliness of American camps, felt a paradoxical surge of unease. The fences and watchtowers, once symbols of confinement, had become familiar boundaries within which they could reflect, dream, and survive. Beyond those boundaries lay the unknown, home. As they packed their few personal belongings, POWs found themselves staring at the footprints left in the mud and snow over the previous months. Each trace of passage a sled mark, a boot print. The faint tracks of animals seemed to echo memories of moments that had reshaped their perception of humanity. They recalled shared laughter over Coca-Cola and ice cream, the warmth of farm families offering bread and clothing, and evenings spent listening to swing music and Hollywood films. The stark contrast between the kindness of strangers and the rigid indoctrination they had carried since youth weighed on every soldier. Some POWs walked the thawing fields in silence, hands buried in pockets, gazing at the distant woods that had once inspired awe. Nostalgia for the camp, for the calm and predictability it had offered, intertwined uneasily with dread of return. Letters written months before remained sealed, words unsent and secrets kept, each representing a tension between gratitude and loyalty. They wondered, had captivity, with its fences and rationed meals, offered them a freedom their homeland could no longer provide? The thaw of snow mirrored the thawing of emotions long suppressed. Soldiers lingered at corners of barns, watched children play near fences, and paused to listen to birds returning after winter. Even the simplicity of melting icicles sliding from roofs seemed laden with meaning reminders that time, like the seasons, could not be paused, only observed and endured. But with each thaw came the inevitable thought of what awaited beyond the barbed wire. Japan's cities lay battered by relentless bombings, families struggled for food. The society they had left was transformed, scarred, and unrecognizable. Conversations in the barracks were quieter now, measured, reflective. Some whispered about hopes for a different life in America, while others clutched letters and documents, unwilling to imagine permanence. Fear returned in sharper form than before. Whereas captivity had imposed structure, the unknown promised chaos, judgment, and potential shame. The prisoners realized that the lessons learned, the trust discovered in human kindness, the simple joys amidst adversity might be tested or lost entirely once they returned to a homeland that had been consumed by war. The camp seemed to hold its breath as the snow fully receded, leaving a mixture of mud, puddles, and nascent green shoots in its wake. Each step across the softening ground felt heavy with memories and unspoken questions. For the first time, the POWs confronted a paradox. They had survived captivity not through endurance alone, but through the humanity extended to them. Yet that very humanity had prepared them for a world they no longer recognized. What awaited them outside the fence's home or only ruins? The morning was still, pale sunlight glinting off the frost that lingered in corners of the barracks. Outside, the camp had settled into an almost ceremonial silence. Soldiers moved with deliberate care, packing their meager belongings into crates and suitcases, each item a fragment of memory. The departure trains waited, engines hissing, ready to carry the POWs back to a land scarred by years of relentless war. Yet for the Japanese soldiers, the physical journey was overshadowed by an internal voyage, one that had reshaped their understanding of humanity, morality, and self. As they filed past the familiar lines of barracks and watchtowers, fleeting images returned unbidden. Children offering small gifts, women handing out bread with smiles, the first taste of sweet ice cream melting on tongues still accustomed to wartime rationing, and the effervescence of Coca-Cola that had elicited laughter and disbelief alike. Even the rhythms of swing music, once foreign and suspect, lingered in their minds, a strange comfort woven into the monotony of captivity. Each memory carried the weight of wonder, guilt, and awe. The trains were lined with guards and a few remaining camp staff. Farewells were quiet but earnest. Farmers who had employed POWs waved from the periphery, some clutching small gifts, homemade goods, wool socks, notes of encouragement. Soldiers, trained to distrust, felt a tension between gratitude and lingering suspicion. How could those they had been taught to hate extend such kindness? Was it generosity, or another form of subtle control? Yet even as questions gnawed, the warmth of these gestures could not be denied. Boarding the cars, the POWs took seats beside comrades who had shared months of fear, surprise, and occasional laughter. Conversation was muted, eyes frequently drifted to the windows, where snow-streaked fields now thawed into brown earth, reminding them of both the passage of seasons and the passage of their own hearts through unexpected growth. Some whispered quietly about American cities they had glimpsed, the clean streets, and the orderly civility, contrasting starkly with their memories of destruction abroad. Others traced the contours of small gifts in their laps, each a tangible proof that humanity could endure even in captivity. On board, the rhythmic clatter of wheels on rails became a backdrop for reflection. Soldiers thought of Japan's ruined cities, the devastation awaiting their return, and families who had survived through unimaginable hardship. Yet, alongside these somber realities existed a paradoxical clarity. The harshest battles had not been fought with bullets or fire, but within hearts and minds reshaped by exposure to decency. The POWs had tasted kindness in its simplest forms: food, music, laughter, and discovered its power to challenge deeply ingrained beliefs. As the train departed the camp, leaving behind watchtowers, fences, and the frozen landscape they had learned to navigate, a sense of closure settled over the men. The camp's rigid order, the unexpected generosity, and the fleeting joys ice cream, Coca-Cola, music, and smiles had etched themselves into memory. These small but profound experiences had survived the constraints of war, transcending ideology and circumstance. For each soldier, the journey ahead was uncertain. Japan awaited with its ruins, ration lines, and societal upheaval. Yet within each man's mind remained the indelible imprint of human kindness experienced far from home. It was a reminder that even amidst the bitterest conditions, compassion could endure and reshape the human spirit. The first taste of ice cream lingered longer than war itself, proof that humanity survived even in captivity. As the trains pulled away, carrying these POWs back to a war-ravaged Japan, they left with more than memories. They carried the weight of wonder, guilt, and a profound realization. Sometimes the greatest battles are fought not with bullets, but with acts of humanity. If this story left you questioning the true meaning of war and kindness, hit the like button, subscribe to Battlefield Secrets, and ring the bell. Dive deeper into the untold stories of World War II with us, because behind every barbed wire fence lies a story the world forgot. Don't miss the next revelation waiting to be uncovered.